We are going to get started, and I would like to begin by introducing myself. I am Theresa Baker, the founder of the Outdoor CEO Diversity Pledge, which is under the umbrella of the In Solidarity Project. I work with various outdoor organizations and retailers and affinity groups across the country on matters of diversity and inclusion and how it relates to the environment. I am happy to be here speaking with you all on matters of thriving together and how we do it as a collective voice and how we bring in our various opinions on how we make it happen beyond the fears that we face in doing it. So with that, I will pass it over to Mr. Jose Gonzalez. And then once he introduces himself, I will come back in and speak on how we do this work. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Teresa. And good morning to everyone calling in from the West Coast out in California in the ancestral traditional stolen and unceded lands of the Nisenan, Southern Maidu, Nisena, Southern Maidu, Miwok, and many others. What is at the moment Sacramento. My background in this is via education. I'm an educator by training in terms of public education, teacher education, outdoor science education, and the like. I'm also reaching you here as the founder of Latino Outdoors, as well as a partner in the Avarna Group in terms of working on quote unquote, equity, inclusion, diversity, justice-oriented practice. So I'm excited to be here and share a few thoughts and be in conversation with Teresa. And of course, we'll welcome observation, thoughts, and questions in the chat as well. Back to you, Teresa.
Thanks, Jose. A lot of the material that Jose and I will cover is only a drop in the bucket of the work that lies ahead of us. Within an hour, we are going to try and get across enough information to keep you intrigued beyond today so that we can find ways to collaborate and work together on these pressing issues around climate change, social injustices, and inclusion of underrepresented communities. So when I speak of communities of color, I am specifically speaking to African American communities, Latino communities, and of course, Native American communities, as well as Asian communities. We all address this work or come to this work from different point of view. So what I'm expressing here is what I have personally learned over the years around lack of inclusion and how it relates to environmental justice. Communities of color are overwhelmingly at a greater disadvantage when it comes to the negative health effects of environmental issues. So of course it makes sense to work with these communities to address climate change and environmental injustices, but that's not happening. When you look at the faces of top environmental orgs, those faces don't look like me. The makeup of the boards don't look like me or Jose. Leadership doesn't look like me. Back in 2018, the Green 2.0 report states that 88% of staff and 95% of boards of environmental NGOs are white. We need to change that if we are going to be more inclusive of the audiences that need to come together to help fight some of these environmental issues. When I look at sustainability managers of most of these companies, again, they are not from underrepresented communities. So how do we change that? How do we fix this? When you look at what's currently underway with the racial demographic shift that's taking place in this country. It demands that we address these issues sooner than later. So how do we do this? How do we make sure that underrepresented communities are not only involved in the conversation, but in the work around climate change, sustainability, and environmental protection, period? That's what we need to address here today and beyond today. When I look at companies that are doing this work, that are reaching people from underrepresented communities, I think of companies like Nike and Adidas, because historically they have reached these underrepresented communities. But what they are not doing is they are not addressing matters around sustainability and environmental protection, which the traditional outdoor orgs and brands are doing. So bringing these two huge companies like Nike and Adidas into conversations or sessions like the one we're having here today would be vital in reaching some of these audiences. You both bring something different to the conversation that's not being had as a collective. While one group brings the audience, the other group brings the information. Somehow we have to find a way to tie those together. So moving forward, how we bring people to the table in sessions such as this, we have to reach across the table and find out how they're doing it. How is each side being successful in what they're accomplishing? Either bringing the conversation or bringing the people. We have to combine the two at some point. And further on, I will continue to address those issues, but right now I'd like for that to sit with you and think of what the makeup of your company looks like. What does your leadership look like? What do your boards look like? What is the message that you're sending out across the board around welcoming underrepresented communities into your fold? How do you do that? Are you seeking help doing that? That's why we're here. Jose and I, we wanted to make sure that our voices were part of this gathering, because we understand the importance of each and every one of you who are attending this gathering. And what we understand more than anything is that this work is not easy. It's difficult. And every day it seems to get more and more difficult. With any step you make, there's the potential from people calling you out for doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing. But what we have to understand is that as a collective, we can no longer just sit back and wait on the right way to do this work. The environment is what's at stake if we don't act sooner than later. It doesn't fall on any one organization here or any one company. It falls on the industry at large. So let's, put our heads together and think of ways we can come together as a collective to address some of these issues that relate not only to business, but as to the coming together of all these various organizations that address environmental issues. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jose.
Thank you, Teresa. And yes, reminder that comments, observations, reflections, questions are welcome in the chat. I'm going to share a few visuals and information that will stress as well as add to what Teresa has been saying and sharing. So what we want to be able to do is start with this idea of what Teresa is mentioning. And because we have it framed as thriving together, and that is intentional in the sense of being able to stress the points of what does it mean that it's both and working on inclusive and equitable practices for a changing and growing demographic. So there's some stated realities in there. And how do we prepare, adapt, and innovate in relation to that? Because we often kind of say that this idea around diversification it's working with innovation and adaptation for innovation rather than just reactive survival. And so what we're sharing with this is one of them. This came out short some time ago, a couple of years ago. This is through FSG, and they were looking at racial equity, but you can look at the way in which you look at equity across a variety of impacted identities. And it's these three takeaways that Teresa is mentioning. Number one is the demographics. So that is a demographic inevitability that you kind of ignore at your own peril, but it doesn't make it go away. And that two, that this has economic impact, both in terms of the value that brands, companies, organizations can benefit from, as well as Teresa likes to stress kind of what you leave on the table, the fact of economic loss, because you're not able to embrace what having a more diverse constituency, demographics, staff, leadership, and so forth. And thus, that's the invitation. Third point, to then really unpack what does this mean? Because often we shy away from some of the hard conversations, the hard reality, or acknowledging why you have to be active in the face of systemic and historic oppression, as an example, and not take those words as necessarily a personal attack on one's identities. But I think it's an opportunity that I always see it as how do we prepare for the future. The demographics, as Teresa was mentioning, there's different ways that you can look at it, but they all trend the same in terms that the demographics of 2050 are just going to be very different than 1950. And so we can't have the same type of models that help shape business or the industry in the 1950s that will hold in the same way for 2050 based on the demographics. And especially that you look at an overall decreasing white demographic, increasing across all other communities. Knowing that, of course, there's a lot of nuance and variety, we can always discuss to how these can all be parsed out, but that the trend is the same. And so it is within this context, I'm not going to read all of this, in which we apply this work and practice of quote unquote DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You might also have justice. The acronym is less important than knowing that as the demographic shifts, we're going from mere tolerance and acceptance of diversity once we began to more seriously tackle legal segregation, to what does this mean in terms of the effect on decision-making spaces? That's what Teresa's talking about. Who's on the boards? Who sits at the CEO table? Who is elected? Who is elected to offices, so that you understand that that has an impact as we're looking in when we talk about beyond diversity and into justice-oriented work. And that this has effects, especially in the outdoor space and the outdoor industry, to be able to unpack a little bit, what do we mean by that in terms of how this both affects how communities are engaged, see themselves reflected and represented, but as well as to how to unpack that a little bit. This is a user curve that's very familiar, probably in tech, and that it's easy to always engage with the intentional users because they're already bought into some effect. And the hard work is in intentional non-users, so that yes, you're always going to have people that say, I'm not interested, or this is not for me, but that there's a difference between saying I really by choice don't feel like doing this, compared to there's a host of reasons that I've never been asked to, or no one has genuinely engaged with, as to why I don't see myself reflected or represented in the way that, for example, quote unquote, the outdoors is constructed. And so we see some of that in a variety of data. This is from the Outdoor Industry Association through the Outdoor Foundations. You kind of see general trends in this regard across demographic representation. But again, it's that invitation to unpack it a little bit more. So in this case, if you see that the green line represents an identified Black demographic here, it's that both and. You can say, A, this is what we mean by underrepresentation. And of course, this means underrepresentation in relation to what? And that's what we mean about in relation to the dominant culture. because we can unpack that and say that is true. And what are ways in which we are sometimes maybe just not asking the right question or not understanding that you can overrepresent even in underrepresentation, ironically enough. And an example of this is the 2017 Nature of American Studies. Here's a contrast. You have a graph that asks, what is the interest in hiking? And the takeaway here is the interest in hiking is lowest among Black adults. And when you see the a lot grouping there, you notice that the lowest at 19% is what's identified as the Black demographic. And that matches this. However, if the question is walking outdoors, now you see that the interest goes up for everybody, to the point that in this case, Black adults are reporting 55%. And so those are the types of questions to be able to ask. What is different about hiking and walking outdoors? Not just rhetorical or for humor, but to be able to say, yeah, what is it? What is it about hiking that has that is a cultural construct in the way that some will not see themselves represented or will answer that question differently? So in closing, for a couple of those things is knowing that undertaking a lot of this work, you run into discomfort, you run into fragility, you run into things that don't maybe feel good, but that's very different than being unsafe. So reflection questions are always important so that we orient discomfort for a state of learning and growing rather than the defensiveness or explaining away our position without being able to ask, why might something like this unsettle me if I'm engaging in anti-oppression or anti-racism work, for example? Is it possible there are dynamics I don't see? And so you can apply these types of questions to be able to say, is it possible, for example, that because I am a white male, that there are some racial and gender dynamics that I don't see? And that opens it up to a different type of conversation than saying, well, it doesn't happen to me, so it's hard for me to believe that that's real. Those are the kind of things that are important. And that ultimately, for me, I often say, one of the things that I love about the outdoors is just I can go out and move my body, and I can set fitness goals, for example. And this that's really how growth happens. It's kind of like exercising. You're putting your body in a physical state of discomfort, but you're doing it with a plan, with a process. That is how growth is happening. So a similar type of social, cultural, emotional discomfort will happen, but having that be growth oriented and supported is part of the work that helps. And last but not least, coming back to what I first shared at the beginning, FSG, they actually have as an example, how models of how this all fits together, because we're talking about not just individual personal change, not just changing the fish in the water, but sometimes you need to change the water as well. So what are some of these conditions when we talk about systems change? And that within this, we do have the relational. These are how we relate to each other. How do we engage with power dynamics within each other? How do we establish relationships? You have the structural. That's the explicit. What are the policies, the practices? How do you hire? How do people get promoted? How do you allocate money and resources? Do you have budget line items for this? Because often, budgets are moral documents in the way that they state what we value. And then the transformative change that's a little harder sometimes is understanding those mental models. What are the mental models that guide a lot of this? And that's what I was talking about. Sometimes we may not think about what do we mean by hiking until we unpack that a little bit more. So I'll stop there and say thank you, so that I'll turn it back over to Teresa and we engage in some more questions and conversation.
Thanks, Jose. One thing that I wanted to, or another thing that I wanted to bring up is spending power. When we look at the outdoor industry as a whole, $887 million is what was projected a year ago for the annual income for the outdoor industry. Black Americans and their spending are becoming an ever larger slice of the U.S. economy, especially spending on consumer goods, ranging from shoes to packs. African American buying power surpassed 1 trillion in 2016 and is projected to be at 1.5 trillion later this year, according to the University of Georgia. That makes Black Americans the largest racial consumer market. Yet they go untapped in this outdoor industry. And there are several reasons why. When I look at the social media feeds of outdoor organizations or brands, I don't see myself represented. And that has to change. And I believe it is changing. But it's not changing at the same rate that it needs to in order to bring these underrepresented communities to the table, specifically the African American community. When I spoke of Nike and Adidas earlier, Adidas recently acknowledged the point that if not for their Black consumers, they would not be leading in a manner in which they are. In a tweet that they sent out, it said that Adidas would be nothing without Black athletes, Black artists, Black employees, and Black consumers. So at the $887 billion annual income that the outdoor industry has experienced, and that did not go down last year in spite of the pandemic and the racial injustice issues that we dealt with. That did not go down based on reports that were sent out earlier this year. So the spending power is still there. People are still drawn to the outdoors. They want to get outdoors more than ever now. So at the rate we're currently going, we're leaving money on the table by not reaching out to these communities who are looking to buy your product. But when we don't see ourselves represented in any segment of your company, marketing campaigns, employees, or specifically when we go into your brick and mortar stores, that's a huge turnoff for us when we go in and we don't see people that look like us. We don't see advertisement that is addressing us. That's a turnoff. So what do? We go to the next store where we feel we are represented, where we feel we are being heard, and that's where we spend our money. That's why Adidas and Nike has such a huge pull on the African American community, because when you see their advertisement, it's always people of color included. So we have to get better at that. The bottom line is that the outdoor industry can do better. And I would say over the past 2 years, I have definitely seen some improvement, but we can still do better. So how do we do that as a collective? How do we reach across the board, reach across the table, and welcome in an audience that traditionally has not been welcomed in these settings? We reach out to affinity groups that are forming every day. There's a new affinity group that pops up. And the reason behind these affinity groups growing at the rate they are is because they don't currently feel connected to what's already in existence. And that's the groups and organizations that you all represent. So for people like Jose and I, it's clear what needs to happen. We need to put aside some of our fears and reach across the table and welcome in these communities into leadership roles, into board roles, into online and offline campaigns on who are these outdoor athletes? Who are these outdoorsy people? And it's not always these amazing elite athletes. it's fine to be able to climb El Cap or to hike for 3-4 months straight along the PCT. That's amazing. I can't do it, but it's amazing for those that can. But the average everyday consumer looks like Jose and myself. We're the ones who you want to buy your gear, because these elite athletes, they're getting the gear for free. So it's the lazy ass weekend hikers that you need to reach out to, people with affinity groups. So what I would like to ask at this point is a couple of questions of Jose, just based on some of the slides that he put out and the questions around how do we do this work. So Jose, this is where I like to start. Jose, how do we, in order to thrive together, we must have equal footing in this work, period. And right now we don't. So how do we thrive together? How do we move forward as a collective when right now it doesn't feel like we are even speaking the same language? Because this is nothing new. This is, people like Frank and Audrey Peterman have been doing this work for years. And it feels like we're still here, fighting the fight that they took on 20 years ago, still having that same conversation. So what do we do as a community of outdoor enthusiasts, people who love and appreciate the outdoors? What do we do? How do we come together in bringing these sides together? How do we do away with this side conversation at all? How do we make it happen? How do we thrive together for better environmental protection?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, one of the first things, as you mentioned, the work of Audrey and Frank Peterman, right? They were sounding this out in the 90s. To be able to say, hey, we're visiting all these national parks and we don't see ourselves included. And that this goes farther back, right? Both within the outdoors, within environmental, within conservation space, and so forth. And there's lessons we can always derive from the environmental justice movement, from mainstream conservation movement, and how does that apply in the outdoors, those kind of components. But I think the two things that give me, that I see as opportunities and challenges with a sense of hope, is one, that I often have these big questions. There's three of them. The first one is, what power am I willing to give up? And some of these sound heavy, like, what do you mean power? I don't have any power. Or that sounds like I'm being accused of having power, or that I don't share or care. And I'm like, well, that's the first thing, right? What happens when you face that question? Because it could literally be saying, you know what, sometimes the power that I have is just the space that I take up in decision making. Sometimes the power that I have is that I'm going to be more believed or seen, or that my ideas and opinions will be valued more without me ever really teasing that out. I just take it to be like, well, obviously I'm smarter, right, or more talented, and then not be able to say, there might be some gender dynamics that are at play, and that's documented. But so to me is that first question. And then the second one is, in service of what? So that when we do this, what comes up when I ask myself that question? Because sometimes we have a lot of good intention, and it doesn't translate into good impact because we think we're doing good without even really asking, in service of what? This might be an opportunity for me to just take a step back, or to make some space for others, because I'm used to being the one that comes in and fix something, and I never wonder or question whether that fits a saviorism model, right? As if like I'm the one that's been prescribing both the pathology and kind of the solution, right? And that's important because with another friend, CJ, right, we often say we have to be cautious that we don't translate black and brown to mean broken. right? Always underrepresented in deficit models, rather than acknowledging, as Teresa's saying, no, there's a lot of community out there with disposable income that is buying this, that is valuing this in ways that doesn't always translate into what we're doing. And then the last one is what thrives and why. And for me, it's that, it's both the idea what you focus on grows, but it's to be able to really ask the questions to say, what are there things we have inherited that no longer serve us in terms of models, in terms of practices, um, in terms of things that we have said, well, that's just the way it's been, or that it is, without questioning why and how it could look different. Because we have a lot of really good models of how to hurt each other. Having models of how we heal each other and how we thrive together is harder, but that's what I mean. The demographic inevitability is still hitting us. So I would close this part by being able to say, sometimes it is being able to say, the power that I give up and in service of what is because I want to be in a space of co-creation. And by being in a space of co-creation, maybe that means that I'm going to invite an affinity group. I'm going to invite a Black creative. I'm going to invite someone to co-create a program, an experience, a design, a campaign. It won't just be some, who's in front of the lens, but who's behind the lens, and that is an acknowledgement that the space is meant to change, because inclusion is an acknowledgement of saying, by including somebody else, I'm open for the space changing, rather than presuming inclusion means just come fit into what I have designed and only that's meant to be. Because I'll close by saying that a lot of conversations now that have been going on is not just get a seat at the table, but people asking, are some of those tables even worth sitting at?
Thanks, Jose. I appreciate that. It's difficult work, as you and I know. And I think part of the problem is that people see it as being difficult. And rather than stepping in and taking some of those hits, they decide, I'm just going to sit on the sideline and watch others do it, watch others make missteps. And then I'll jump in and avoid those missteps so that I won't be part of this call out culture. So I think part of the work that you and I both do is finding ways to make people feel comfortable enough to do this work, just as it is the other side's responsibility to make it feel comfortable for us to come into their space, to apply for these positions that we know we are qualified for, but we are hesitant because we don't know how we will be accepted into that spot. So how do we thrive as a collective audience with the understanding that the environment must come first, and including underrepresented communities in that conversation is a must? So how do we do that? How do we make it comfortable to come together and thrive together?
It's a recognition there is no planet B, right? Or in case that's not clear, it's a pun on plan A, plan B, then planet A, planet B. But that's that, climate change and a lot of the aspects of environmental damage and pollution doesn't respect boundaries in the way that we sometimes like our human boundaries to be very clear cut. We design a line around a national park and saying, there we go, protected. Climate change doesn't go, oh, hold up, yeah, I can't step over that line because it's protected. And so there's that recognition that it hits us all, and that inequity by definition means that it doesn't hit us all the same because we have some systemic gaps that have been built in. Redlining as a classic example now, we literally have these maps, right, that were rated according to how investment or resource worthy they were. And it just so happens that it was the Black families that lived in the red areas to be able to say, these are the worst areas to live in, so we're going to disinvest in them. That's a great combination of both, that it wasn't just personal choices, and it wasn't like this clear, overt plan that was in place. It was a combination of both of those things. It wasn't Black families saying, oh yeah, I definitely want to live here and not live over there. There were things in terms of, can you get a loan? Would the realtor even want to show you the house? Would the neighbors welcome you? So, and that isn't just about housing. That impacts access to green space. It access health. You can overlay these maps according to access to nature, to COVID, to asthma, to a whole things, you name it. And so I say this because I look this as the opportunity to say, we could keep sustaining those maps. I would hate for that to be the case, but we can take the action now to say, how do we change those? How do we change things now? So not just so that those maps from the past don't persist, but that 50 years from now, I want to say, what do those maps of the future look like because of what we're doing now? So I say that because it's studies and research continues to show that communities of color consistently at times are highest rated in terms of environmental concern around climate change, protection of public lands, willing to support policies, willing to even tax or pay even more for some of these. But the question is, it's important to be able to say, how are they engaged with that and disengaged with that? Not just because of a lack of interest, but because the way that we incorporate their input, their leadership, and how they see themselves represented in the type of impact they want to see is there. Because otherwise, what reminds them is that we can invest millions of dollars in wildland protections. Like Teresa, like you're saying, that's amazing. Heck yeah, I want the Arctic refuge to stay protected. And if I am seeing, great, we seem to care a lot about that, but but I don't see that same caring concern in my community and how you are supporting that as well. We have to be aware of that disconnect.
Right. I think it's disappointingly that the institutional settings and professional workplaces that house and advance environmental work in some ways mirror the environmental injustices that unfold in our society. Just as environmental racism and discriminatory acts exclude people of color from access to clean water, clean air, and other aspects of the natural world that can show a direct effect on how that determines health outcomes for people from underrepresented communities, but specifically communities of color. I think that it's a whole lot to take in, Jose. It's a lot. And with everything that we look at on a personal level, we often think, am I in a position to take on more? And the answer has to be yes. It's daunting. I can't tell you how many people who do this DEI work that I speak to on the daily just throw their hands up and say, I'm tired. I'm overwhelmed. I'm tired. Since the pandemic, since March of last year, the work level for DEI consultants across the country has grown tremendously. There's not one of us, including Mr. Gonzalez, that isn't on a Zoom call at least 3-4 times a day speaking on these very topics. So my question is, how do we engage traditional environmental organizations, companies, brands? How do we engage them in this conversation without necessarily sitting at the table with them to help guide them along? How do we get them to take on some of these issues within and come up with some of these answers on their own? Because eventually we can sit around the table and tell people how to do this work every day. But at some point, these companies are going to have to step out on their own and take some of the chances and risk that they do every day at business. They're going to have to do it on their own. So how do we arm them with the ability to do what we do every day without the fear of, being called out? How do we give them the opportunity to try, fail, and try again? How do we do that?
Yeah, it's important to stress how daunting this can all be and seem on all sides. And I'm reminded of a couple things. First and foremost, I'm like, as an industry, and even just as a movement, we still have agreed to tackle the daunting challenge of climate change at large. We have agreed to create sustainability practices across the industry. Those are not just simple, those are not simple engineering problems. In policy work, right, those are called wicked problems because they have a sense of a lot of complexity, of you're deferring some of the benefits farther off, that you have values embedded within that. And so the fact that sometimes we're able to say, heck yes, this is worth tackling, but all of a sudden in systemic racism, it's like, oh, well, how do we even approach that? And that's not to be dismissive and kind of say, right, like to devalue, to have false equivalences or comparisons. But I think it's for me to be able to say, the human innovation continues to astound. And sometimes I am amazed at the things that we can create. And that's to me both the exasperation as well as the inspiration for tackling some of these things, right? To be able to say, hey, if we can get some of these pros out to Mars, I'm like, that is amazing. And how about we tackle some systemic racism at home as well, right? It's not an either or, because often that default happens where people are saying, oh, we're spending millions of dollars for this or that. I'm like, no, this is that both and shift in thinking compared to either or deficit zero sum loss thinking that usually limits us and gets us into that trouble. So that's the first part. And then the second last one is for me that there is the sense that we all have our work to do. And that's why I start with some of these questions of reflection so that I can engage my own learning and see how do I approach that so that the default doesn't become, let me just ask Teresa. Let me ask the woman of color to do the emotional labor. Let me ask the Black woman to do the emotional labor of educating me. Sometimes that might be an opportunity and you're gifted with that. You might have Teresa, you might have Dr. Carolyn Finney be able to say, I am here to be in this role, but don't expect this of everyone that looks like me. Or we're afraid to do anything because we're afraid we're going to be, quote unquote, called out or canceled on social media, tarred and feathered, like name your component. But then that also doesn't, passiveness doesn't do anything in the face of what's at play. So that's why I then look at what are the models we have that have been helping us. I look to the language of ecology, right, to be able to say, look, what have we learned about wildfire management and acknowledging that the over-suppression of wildfire, your old school Smokey the Bear, put out all fires, wasn't healthy. We thought we were doing good, but that wasn't healthy. We needed a level of prescribed burning, especially in fire-adapted landscapes. So then I look at what is the prescribed burning what is our prescribed burning for all of our spaces, including our relationships, including the way that we do things in some of these spaces. That's engaging in the tension and conflict of being able to say some of the stuff, let's get rid of it now, because otherwise we're setting up a tinderbox. And that lastly, that it seems like social justice and inequities are this outside thing from our stuff, but so much of this is embedded in land. The fact of who has had access to land, who was able to quote unquote own land, who was dispossessed from land, who could derive generational wealth from land, and who continues to derive some of those benefits from it. So to me, that's a reminder, hey, this is actually core to what we do. We are tackling this and now because we're at the center of it rather as this kind of far away idea.
Right. I was once approached about a problem that I had never had any experience at and was scared to speak up about it, didn't know what to do. And it bothered me for a couple of weeks. And finally, one day I said to myself, just because I don't know what to do doesn't give me a pass to do nothing. And I think all too often that's where we find ourselves stuck, is we don't know what to do. We don't know how to do it. It's not our landscape. Sure, we care about these inequities, but who am I to step in and lend my voice or my work to something that I'm uncertain about? But what I know is that if we just sit back and lean on the excuse of not knowing what to do, nothing will change. In 5 years, Jose, you and I will be having the same conversation because nothing's changing. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because gatherings such as this are taking place and giving us an opportunity to share with an audience that we don't normally reach what we are working on and how we hope to work with them. I'm hopeful that Deb Haaland is now the Secretary of the Interior. We're bringing in a Native American voice to address some of these issues around our public lands. What gives you hope, Jose? What are you hopeful for? What are you looking forward to?
I'm hopeful in the sense that there's a sense of what legacy we're leaving behind that's different. And I say that in the sense of, I sometimes ask myself the question, what would the person that you would like to be do what you're about to do now in cases where I get stuck? Because it'll help me think about, right? What is the impact and legacy of our actions and words? Knowing that, same thing, it's like climate change. We're being asked to embrace some of the sacrifice now, knowing that the benefits are farther off. And sometimes that very much goes against our our cognitive wiring of needing and wanting, being biased towards the present and valuing that. And of course, there's reason for that. There's value to that. But it's knowing that we can do this. And pick your favorite quote. It's like there's a whole host of them. You plant the tree knowing that the shade may not be for you, but that doesn't stop you from doing that. And I close this to the sense, I think as someone mentioned in the chat, regenerate, because I'm looking at the hope is how do we heal severed connections? For me, the big picture is knowing that I want to shift from a mechanistic reductionist logic of how we've interacted with each other in the land that sees the tree as just the tree, that we've otherized others to rationalize why they're lesser, and how do I reconnect that to a life-affirming logic, and then begin to pick at that, so that rather than saying, well, that's a well-oiled machine when I'm talking about a team, and I'll say, what changes when I think, well, that's a well-sustained meadow of a team. How does that shift my thinking? And that inspires me to look at how we are reconnected to regenerative cycles, because now I'm being part of something that will be sustaining and thriving, rather than being part of the disruption that caused that destruction. And of course, we see this in climate change, right? Climate change is the disruption of the carbon cycle. And I want to be part of the solution that will perpetuate those good cycles, rather than being part of the reasons that I'm perpetuating bad cycles.
I think that's the one thing that we all hold in the space currently is hope and the means to do something that until long after we're gone. And that's how life works. Those who came before me didn't see freedom, but prayed and hoped for it. And I am that hope that they hoped. I am that prayer answered for them. And the work that we do, you as the founder of Latino Outdoors, myself, the various affinity groups out there, I think we do this work with the understanding that change may not come as quickly as we would like it to. I'm sure Audrey and Frank thought 20 years ago, in 2 years, we will have made a difference. And here we are 20 years later, still having the same conversations with the same organizations. Just as this audience who is listening to us here, just as these organizations that are part of the overall event, the means to make change is with them. Will they see it? Probably not. But my hope is that through events such as this, we can find a commonality that we can all land on and work for that future, for that better that we may not see. For that tree that we plant today that you speak of, that we may not be able to sit under, but the generations we're fighting for today will, and they can point back to us and be, well, because of this person, that tree is providing shade to me today. And I think that's where we land with a lot of these companies right now, is that the satisfaction isn't immediate. So, seeing the result isn't going to happen in their current position. So my hope for this audience is that they take away something that we've said today and build on that they reach out to us or someone in the DEI space that they can connect with in their community or through their social media feeds to begin to build what better can look like for them so that they can throw their name in the hat and be part of the change that's inevitable, but slow in coming.
I was going to say it's being able to reflect on what is the work we do as future ancestors, right? And to me, that's what inspires me in that sense. And I'll close my part by saying, because often it is systemic stuff can just feel and seem so big, and it is. That requires collective action. It requires policy, influence and implementation, but that's still all guided by people. And yeah, there's challenges in being able to affect in terms of who owns resources and wealth, right? That either facilitate or inhibit that. But still, I think in terms of, I'm reminded of when I was mentioning exercising, right, or trail running, and I'm saying that is, if I've never run before, I'm not gonna sign up for the marathon tomorrow because that's how I can hurt myself or probably hurt somebody else or hurt others. But then I don't say, well, it's just so much. Why bother? I start, and I begin to run. And I just don't run carelessly. I'm feeling the discomfort, but again, that's growth. That's what's going to help me build muscle. That's what's going to help me run longer. I also pay attention to what will support that, what the shoes are, who I might have as coaches, what nutrition I'm taking in. So that same thing, right? What is the nutrition in terms of what's helping me support this? And knowing that, as I can say, you don't lift the heaviest thing just because you're being told, just go do the hardest, most impactful work, but you're doing it as part of a plan, and it's ongoing. You know that's part of how that process works. So I know, I think John mentioned in there, right, as we need to own the emotional labor. And that is true. And that's gonna feel heavy, but that's also why you have recovery days. That's also why you rest. That's also why you ensure that your own regenerative cycles within you're supporting those to care for that.
Right. I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions from the audience that we can try and answer. What I would also like to say to those of you who are listening, who are marketing managers, who are sustainability managers, we see and hear you. We know that the work you do is overwhelming at times. We understand that. But we would also like to ask of you, and if there are board members or leadership watching, that you all take on a greater role in this. It's an amazing opportunity to have a founder of a company, a GM, a CEO of a company, sit with their staff, because I've done it before, just to hear your employees, what some of their concerns are, what their hopes are for the company as a whole. There are people that are ready and willing to lead within these companies. They just need to know that they are supported by their CEOs and by their GMs and by their board. So I would definitely say, put that out there, that, the higher ups pay attention to everyone within the company. That's a hell of a task to take on, Teresa. Dang. But we have to have buy-in from every aspect so that we feel comfortable in doing this work. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, please put them out there. We have a few minutes left. Or if you just want to address some of the comments in the chat, Jose, that's cool too.
I've been looking. I know there's a slight delay, so we might not catch all of them. So apologies beforehand. I think it's the, and I appreciate a lot of your sharing resources there as well. So that's also a great thing. For some of you, you might see a book or an article that you haven't seen before. That's another great practice in terms of supporting each other. And I know there's Alyssa mentioned on here, right? If it means bringing a consultant into the organization, if that's the option you have at hand, then paying those consultants well for their emotional labor and knowledge. I know that is an example that the Petermans would often say, like, wait a minute, if I was any other type of consultant, would my fee be in question? Or is it because I'm a DEI consultant that there's a presumption that I should either A, you don't understand the value of the work that goes into this, or B, that you feel it should be less or free because it's in service to the community? So that's a good question and reflection.
Yeah, it is. And that's a conversation that we'll be having next week, actually. Addressing compensation around DEI. There are a lot of resources that Jose and I can offer you, and by no means are we the only two people that do this work. There are a lot of individuals out there, as I mentioned before, Dr. Carolyn Finney, Frank and Audrey Peterman. There's, of course, the organization that Jose started, Latino Outdoors. There's, of course, the always wild Patagonia, who does their own work. There's Vasu, a disabled athlete for North Face. There are a lot of people out here doing this work. Please reach out to those you feel comfortable having a conversation with. We totally understand this work is not easy, it's difficult, but we want to make sure we're providing you with the resources you need to feel a little more comfortable. And maybe this is the first conversation you've ever had, but we want to make sure it's not the last. We care about all these outdoor spaces that we hike and climb and ski in. We better begin to care about lack of inclusion across the board. As I stated before, with the racial demographic shift that's taking place, we all need to be at the table to make sure we are addressing these environmental issues moving forward.
Yeah, and I agree on the Othering and Belonging Institute that's a great resource as well. I'll close my part by saying, reminder that one way that I look at this is we account for equity to be able to attain the equality that we often are working for. And so equality is part of that goal. It's just acknowledging that we've had different starting places, and it wasn't just by personal choice. And it doesn't mean that we don't all work hard, and it doesn't, right? It's all of these components, and it means that race is a social construct, meaning we've made it up, and that even as we've made it up, it still impacts us very differently in interacting with law enforcement, for example. But because we've made it up, it means we have these abilities to be able to rethink, redo them, and account and understand that when we're talking about this, they are in service of being able to move in that forward direction rather than keep us stuck here.
Thank you all for joining us. Feel free to reach out. Have fun.
Yes.
Above all, have fun, but be committed to the long game. Thank you.
Thank you.